Get started. My name is Aaron Harold, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Political Science and International Relations here at SUNY Geneseo. And together with Carly Harold, I am co-director of the Forum on Constitutionalism and Democracy. Our forum was established in 2019 to support Geneseo's mission as a public liberal arts college by sponsoring programming and fostering campus conversations about civic education and liberal democracy. And we're supported by a grant from the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History. And we'd like to start by thanking them for helping to make tonight's event possible. Before I introduce our speaker for the evening, I'd also quickly like to mention two other virtual events that we're going to be hosting later this semester. On April 8th at 4 o'clock, we're going to be hosting a discussion on the meaning of education in a time of political turmoil. And that's going to feature Olufemi Taiwo, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown, and Lauren Hall, who's an associate professor of political science at RIT. And then on April 16th, we'll be hosting Seth Jaffe, who's assistant professor of politics and international affairs at John Cabot University in Rome. And he's going to be speaking on the way the insights of Thucydides can help us think about American foreign policy and especially the US-China relationship. So please stay tuned for announcements in the near future with additional details about those events. I'd like now to introduce tonight's speaker. Benjamin Kleinerman is the R.W. Morrison Chair of Political Science at Baylor University, where he teaches courses on both political thought and political institutions. His research focuses on the relationship between executive power and the constitutional order, and he's published articles in Perspectives on Politics, the American Political Science Review, the Texas Law Review, as well as several edited volumes. His first book, The Discretionary President, The Promise and Perils of Executive Power, is a classic work on the tension between law and executive power in our constitutional system. And he's previously held teaching positions at Harvard, Princeton, and the James Madison College at Michigan State University, another premier public liberal arts college. Now, in addition to all of this, Professor Kleinerman is also the editor of The Constitutionalist, a recently launched website and blog that features essays by leading experts in political philosophy, American political development, public law, and political culture and literature in an effort to foster conversation about the creation and maintenance of good constitutions. This website, which I can highly recommend, not only contains some of the most interesting and thoughtful commentary on our politics that's available today, but it's also a helpful antidote to the immoderate and polarizing tendencies that too often characterizes so much of our political discourse at the present moment. And finally, I just want to mention a couple housekeeping things. Please be sure that your Zoom mics are on mute throughout the presentation. And if you can, please do turn your cameras on if you're able to. It really does help reinforce the atmosphere of an in-person lecture as much as that's possible. And also just to let you know, as you can probably see in the top left corner of your screen, this session is being recorded. We will have times for questions and some discussion with Professor Kleinerman after his remarks. So please join me and clap your virtual hands in welcoming Professor Benjamin Kleinerman.
All right, thank you, Aaron. This is, I'm excited to be here. I didn't realize you were a public liberal arts college. I just left a place like that, Michigan State, for years. It was wonderful. Yeah, thank you. This is very nice. It's always kind of it's both nice to be able to give talks everywhere that you wouldn't be able to otherwise, but unfortunate that you don't get the dinners and the socialization that typically accompanies such talks. So maybe next time. So first, I'm going to talk about what I'm calling the crisis presidency. In order to illustrate some of my points, I'm going to play some, hopefully the video will share properly, play some video along the way that I think nicely illustrates the argument, or often illustrates the argument. The videos will be partisan in one way or another because they're framing presidential elections, and it's the framing that I think is interesting. But so excuse the partisanship. I try not to be partisan in these things, but it is going to end up, hopefully there's a kind of equal amount of partisanship in both directions. But so I'm going to first play this first clip. Let's see, why is it not sharing?
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them. They've slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Those who are lost now, their legacy must be our lives.
I can hear you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Amazing grace.
I am dispatching thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers. We dominate the streets.
I won't traffic in fear and division. I won't fan the flames of hate.
It's time to pick up our heads. Remember who we are. This is the United States of America.
So I think I start with that clip because I think it encapsulates well the nature of the presidency. It illustrates what we most want from presidents. We want them to unite us. We want them to guide us toward our better natures. And most importantly, that we want them to make us feel secure during and after crises that leave us feeling profoundly insecure. Each one of those speeches was a response to a crisis of one sort or another. As the makers of that commercial well understand, we're almost moved to tears, or at least the tingles, by the way presidents can make us feel that security. And it's kind of bipartisan tingles, in a way. Yet what's strange is that the people who best understand this about the nature of the presidency are those who make commercials like that. Surprisingly, my profession of political science, which you would think should be able to teach us something about the character of presidential authority, have written very little, at least in the last 30 or to 40 years about it. So there's this funny gap between what we as a people and what people who make those commercials know and what political scientists know. And in a strange way, political scientists know less than anyone about the presidency. And so this is why I'm in the midst of writing a book on the nature of the presidential power and our expectations of the presidency. I'm trying to solve this gap in our political science's understanding of presidential authority. I'm calling the book Crisis Presidency because I think crises make more clear than anything else both what we want from presidents and when and why presidents have most authority. Each president in that video is responding to a crisis. I've been writing this book for a long time. My wife would say it's been too damn long. So long that my original intent was to finish it before Obama left office. I wanted to finish it before he left office because I thought his presidency an excellent illustration of what was my argument at that point. My initial argument before the book stretched 4 years into the future was that presidents, no matter how they campaigned or how they might have wanted to govern, end up pivoting in the direction of their commander-in-chief powers. So although Obama campaigned as a strong critic of Bush's use of executive power, especially his use of that power in foreign policy and the war on terror, by Obama's campaign for his second term, he was running commercials like this. And again, I'm going to try to.
That's one thing George Bush said, it was right. The president is the decider in chief. Nobody can make that decision for you. Look, he knew what would happen. Suppose the Navy SEALs had gone in there and it hadn't been bin Laden. Suppose they'd been captured or killed. The downside would have been horrible for him. But he reasoned. I cannot in good conscience do nothing. He took the harder and the more honorable path, and the one that produced, in my opinion.
I don't think that started. Did I not share from the beginning? Oh,
That's one thing George Bush said, it was right. The president is the decider in chief. Nobody can make that decision for you. Look, he knew what would happen. Suppose the Navy SEALs had gone in there and it hadn't been bin Laden. Suppose they'd been captured or killed. The downside would have been horrible for him. But he reasoned, I cannot in good conscience do nothing. He took the harder and the more honorable path, and the one that produced, in my opinion, the best result.
It's not worth moving heaven and earth, spending billions of dollars just trying to catch one person. He was referring to the hunt for Osama bin Laden. What did he mean by that? Because it's generated a little controversy, given Osama bin Laden's role in killing, 3,000 Americans on 9/11.
He had to decide. And that's what you hire a president to do. You hire the president to make the calls when no one else can do it.
So Obama, I think that clip illustrates well that Obama realized.
Thank you. God bless you. And God bless.
Obama realized I'm not sharing anymore, right? No, all right. Obama realized that his re-election campaign could no longer depend on quote unquote change you can believe in. That's his first campaign slogan. It had to depend now on his success during his first term in office, especially his success in the areas over which presidents have most authority and most leadership potential, crises and foreign policy. Only the president could quote unquote, make the call to cross into Pakistan in order to kill bin Laden. Ultimately, our recent presidents have campaigned for re-election not so much on their legislative successes as on their success at fulfilling the key aspect of the job. Notice Clinton's language in that commercial. You quote unquote hire a president to make key decisions in situations like this. Clinton, Obama, and Bush all mentioned in that commercial, all re-elected for a second term, and all found greatest authority in what I would call the distinctly presidential components of the office. They were hired not to achieve legislative successes, but to fill the executive nature of the office. You never see a commercial for a senator running for re-election which talked about hiring him in that way. Although presidents, and what's funny is that presidents campaign in their first term as though what the presidency is about is legislative change. But by their second term, they've realized that the Constitution and their ambition push them in a different direction, that it's much better for Obama's ambition to be reelected and to be considered a great president, not to campaign on legislative change, but to stare out windows and seem presidential. But over time, so that's about the first book, I realized that book, for which Obama was the perfect case study, depended on a prior book showing the distinctive characteristics of the presidency in the constitutional order and showing the people's relationship to the constitutional presidency. In other words, I had to show why presidents pivot in the direction of commander-in-chief powers, what it is about the separation of powers system that makes them do that. Initially, this was all going to be part of one doorstep, which was ability to handle crises. Its foreign policy authority, I would say, arises from and relates to this crisis authority. Insofar as the president has crisis authority, he has authority over the foreign policy that relates to those crises. Fortuitously, at least for me, but perhaps not for anyone else, the president that accompanied this book failed partially because I would say he couldn't handle a crisis. The centrality of that fact to Trump's defeat, and then the centrality of presidential crisis power is represented well by the following. And again, I'm going to try to share.
When coronavirus came, Trump froze like a deer in the headlights. For months, the threats grew bigger. The warning signs became more ominous. The alarms flashed red. And there was our president, unprepared, indecisive, frozen, paralyzed by his fear of offending the Chinese government and losing his precious trade deal. Panicked at the thought of what a stock market collapse would mean to his re-election. So he failed to act, and the virus got out of control and shut down the nation.
All right, I forgot. See, my son told me not to do this. He said I am not capable of confidently doing. So let me try again and press share this time. All right.
When coronavirus came, Trump froze like a deer in the headlights. For months, the threats grew bigger. The warning signs became more ominous. The alarms flashed red. And there was our president, unprepared, indecisive, frozen, paralyzed by his fear of offending the Chinese government and losing his precious trade deal. Panicked at the thought of what a stock market collapse would mean to his re-election. So he failed to act, and the virus got out of control and shut down the nation and crushed the economy. Now, nearly 100,000 have died. 38 million unemployment claims and rising. In this crisis, Donald Trump wasn't a president. He was a deer in the headlights, too scared to act, too panicked to tell the truth, too weak to lead. A president who can't handle a crisis is no president at all.
So the ending of that commercial, I think, is the perfect. It's the perfect epigraph to my book. It's as though it's sort of tailor-made, because I think this is what I'm arguing. That is that a president who cannot handle a crisis is no president at all. And to understand that, I think we have to recover the proper understanding of presidential authority. It's odd because at an almost instinctive level, we as a people already do understand the nature of presidential authority. We reward or hire presidents or rehire presidents who fulfill that authority and punish or fire presidents who don't. And yet we vote for presidents, and presidents campaign, especially in their first term, as though what matters will be their legislative successes. Presidents don't campaign for the job for which we're supposedly hiring them. Candidates don't give us detailed accounts of their plans for handling crises. In other words, in a funny way, what we should be asking is, how well is that president going to handle a crisis? How well, that's who we're hiring, not what legislative plan do they have. They give us detailed accounts, though, of their legislative ambition. The only sign, I'd say, of our instinct for someone distinctly presidential is that we tend to choose presidents who seem like they'd be the kind of people who could handle crises. That is, they project the kind of confidence, solidity, and statesmanship that we would need when distinctly presidential authority becomes most necessary. That is, at a deeper, almost instinctive level, we want presidents who are presidential. The very use of that term presidential, or sometimes Washingtonian, says much about what we actually want from the presidency. In other words, although some might like the idea of Bernie Sanders legislating, I suspect even the Bernie bros might pause at the idea of hiring him for the presidency. This is why in 2016, I was convinced in both the Republican primaries and then in the general election that there was no way Trump could be elected. He just doesn't seem presidential. He didn't seem like the kind of man who would be capable of handling crises. I suppose his supporters, though, saw virtues that also could be defined as presidential. He seemed tough and decisive. He had a lifetime in business, which might indicate real executive qualities. That is, I would say that both his supporters and his opposition were judging him ultimately on these presidential questions. In other words, the debate about Trump was actually really was a debate about his presidential characteristics, statesmanship and sort of solidity or tough and decisive. They weren't then judging his policies, they were judging his temperament. You know, in a funny way, sometimes the American people are criticized for judging this rather than policies. It's an election, people will say, or critics will say, is only a popularity contest rather than a real debate about the issues. I would say, though, that in judging temperament rather than policies, the American people actually reveal a better understanding of the nature of presidential authority than the critics. The so-called experts are getting it wrong, and the people are getting it right. It should be something of a popularity contest. In other words, that the debates don't focus on issues at all isn't, in a way, a problem. They should be focusing on who's going to handle pressure better, who's going to seem more presidential in the context of a debate. So in other words, we have an instinctive understanding, we as a people have an instinctive understanding of presidential authority, but not much of an articulation of it. Relatively popular writers about American politics and even, or especially political scientists, have no strong account of the separation of powers that would account for our continued attraction to presidential presidents. We use the word presidential, but we don't have an adequate account as to what that means or why it's important. Instead, so much of the media discussion and debates center on their policies. The importance of the presidential ability to handle crises lingers in the background in commercials like those I've shown, but not discussed openly. It's almost like we're all ashamed that we're not judging on the basis of serious things like policies. As I've said, we're judging presidents, though, on precisely the things for which we should be judging them. So we should stop being ashamed for not talking about the issues. Because we don't have an adequate discussion of this component of presidential authority, we feel ashamed for doing the thing that we should actually be doing. I'd say we're making this error because we, even or especially we political scientists, have forgotten what the separation of powers means. Both Woodrow Wilson and then 50 years later, the famed presidency scholar Richard Neustadt have called it, quote unquote, separated institutions sharing power. According to this definition, the point of separation is to create checks and balances. Bearing the dangers of unalloyed power, the founders, Wilson says, wrap power up into a ball so that nothing bad could happen with it. This account is neither a good account of the founders nor an account that can explain the nature of presidential authority. Checks and balances exist to preserve the separation of functions. Separation of powers doesn't exist to make checks and balances possible. I think the latter teaching is the way we've now mistakenly understood checks and balances, the system of checks and balances. It's a thing I want if they get one thing out of my class, I want them to understand that checks and balances is different than separation of powers and exists to preserve the separation of powers. So Neustadt doesn't care, claims not to care what the founders think because he focuses exclusively on power and presidential power and ignores what he calls, quote, the literary theories of the Constitution. As a supposed hard-headed realist, he has no time for constitutional theories. But by ignoring the Constitution, writers like Neustadt and generations of presidency scholars since couldn't explain the nature of presidential authority. Someone who has been, again, hired with a job to do has very different authority than someone chosen to represent the people's wants and interests. So what is the nature of this authority and the separation of powers? Presidents, unlike anyone else in government, are explicitly instructed by the Constitution itself to take an oath, quote, that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. The oath is their very first act as president. It signals that they have assumed the office. They are president once they have said the oath, but not before. The oath indicates perhaps better than anything else the job-like nature of their office. The very first thing they do is an oath to the job. Judges and legislatures do take an oath to follow the Constitution, but it's not public in the same way and is not prescribed by the Constitution. Presidents take an oath too, not so much to follow it as to execute their office and to, quote, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. I heard some of you are about to study Locke on prerogative. This would be relevant to that study. Lincoln illustrates in the Civil War that the oath to follow the Constitution, that is, the oath to obey the Constitution, is dramatically different than the oath to preserve, protect, and defend it. They're different kinds of things. The latter, that is, preserve, protect, and defend, might demand the kinds of seemingly unconstitutional actions that Lincoln took in order to preserve it. The more general lesson is that the Constitution assigns to presidents a preservative authority that it assigns to no one else. Once they take the oath, there is a clear signal that the responsibility is now on them. If they fail to live up to that responsibility, the people's constitutional instincts teach them to disapprove of the president. They love presidents who make them feel safe during crises. They don't like those who don't. Given that political scientists aim to be hard-headed realists about the way politics actually work, it's striking that they pay so little attention to this seemingly obvious component of presidential authority. To explain why presidents fail and why they succeed, we have to integrate their preservative authority. Whereas the people blame legislators if they fail to live up to their legislative promises, they don't blame presidents for this. Re-election campaigns don't tend to revolve around whether a president fulfilled all their promises. And whereas the people blame presidents for failing to respond effectively to crises, they don't blame legislatures. No one was running for the Senate in the last election with a senator who cannot respond to a crisis is no senator at all. That's gibberish. That doesn't make sense. Presidents are at the center of our constitutional order insofar as they are essential to its preservation. This is one of the crucial inventions of the founders. An executive who would be like a king in his preservation of order and stability, but who would still be representative in the sense that the people too want order and stability. That is, the president represents the people's executive concerns. Republics of the past represented the people's legislative concerns, but when they threw out the king, they threw out the stability that only executives could provide. Many of the states prior to the formation of the Constitution had done the same. They created weak executives on the principle that kings were no longer necessary and representative assemblies were all that mattered now. Shays' Rebellion, in which there was no effective response to massive riots, represents the failure of that approach. Our Constitution, the founders of our Constitution understood that executive concerns for stability and security were at least as important, if not more so, than legislative concerns for representation. And that's what republics of the past got wrong. They remembered the representation, but they didn't remember the concern for stability. They threw out the king, the representative stability, and didn't put anything in its place. So in the analogous Whiskey Rebellion, after the formation of the Constitution with a strong executive, the riots stopped because the president sent massive numbers of troops to Western Pennsylvania. Executives could now respond to crises when they occur in a way that they could not before the Constitution was formed. You know, the bookend of the Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion almost perfectly illustrates what executive power does for the constitutional order. Some people accuse Washington and Hamilton of manufacturing in a way the Whiskey Rebellion in order to illustrate precisely that. I'm not sure that's right, but nonetheless, founders always referred to as exigencies. Both man-made and non-man-made, that is, both man-made and non-man-made emergencies are a constant feature of political life. A strong president that can respond energetically and decisively is essential to the long-term preservation of the regime. I said at the outset that the Trump presidency was fortuitous for the sake of my argument, because it almost perfectly illustrates my claim about the consequences of presidential crisis failure. If not for the COVID crisis, the success of the economy might have won him a second term. So although Trump's election might have contradicted my claim about that the people want presidents who seem presidential, his defeat, that is, suggests that they definitely want presidents who behave presidentially in crises. That they might have initially departed from this presidential wish, but they saw in the crisis that they really did want it. Because I think Trump's handling of the crisis had the biggest impact on his failure to get reelected. A certain portion of the American people had come to accept Trump's unpresidential behavior so long as it seemed like he was doing a good job. But as I said before, they want presidential behavior because it makes them feel taken care of. A presidential president would have the strength, decisiveness, and foresight to handle any crisis. Trump seemed to have none of those characteristics. Although for many, including myself, the lack of those characteristics was always unsettling, a significant enough portion of the American public was behind him that it didn't matter until a real crisis came. The real crisis brought out, I'd say, and highlighted all of the presidential virtues that he lacked. Thus, instead of feeling confident that he could handle the crisis, more and more people felt unsettled by news conferences focused not on the crisis, but on his bizarre antics. Rather than delivering speeches which would at least give us hope that we could make it through this, he instead blamed others and complained that no one was giving him enough respect or credit. In a crisis, the American people want presidents who can manage the crisis, but they will also want presidents who can make them feel that they can manage the crisis. And I'd say the second rhetorical component of crisis management is more than just optics. So they want someone who can manage it, but they also want someone who can make them feel that they can manage it. And those optics are politically important in a substantive way. Presidents both settle our politics and make us feel settled. And so the kind of appearance of management is as important, or at least almost as important as the management itself. So after 9/11, most of you are probably too young to remember this or weren't alive yet. But after 9/11, when Bush appeared, it made us all feel that there was at least still someone in charge. I can remember sort of waiting for that moment after the planes crashed for Bush to appear so that we knew we still had someone in charge. And then his posture of strength and decisiveness united us around him. He succeeded in the first place, not because of the way he handled the crisis, but because of the way he made us feel that he, and by extension, we could handle the crisis. I'd say if Trump had projected that same kind of strength and decisiveness, we might also have united around him during the COVID crisis. In other words, crises are the crucial testing grounds for presidents. Either makes them or breaks them. And success from the standpoint of increased approval ratings. So sometimes presidents' approval ratings shoot up or they shoot way down depending on how they respond to the crisis. And it's about more than just managing it successfully. It's also about projecting the ability to manage it successfully. So just a couple case studies to illustrate my point, and then I've gone too long, so I'll finish. I won't show the next video. But after 9/11, George W. Bush projected confidence and resolve in the face of these attacks. So I had the YouTube, I would have shown you the YouTube video where he's standing on the rubble and says, you know, everyone will hear us soon. Standing on the rubble of the World Trade Center, he projected confidence and resolve around which we could unify as a nation. The president's confidence and resolve made us all feel the same. So presidents, in other words, have this way in which their projection makes us feel the same. By contrast, well, and so one illustration of that is my sister, at least at that point in her life, was about the most liberal Democrat, as you could imagine, definitely voted for Gore in 2000. But I remember her saying to me, and she'd probably deny this now, but I remember her saying to me, you know, at the end of the day, I'm glad Bush is president, because Gore would have responded to this in a much less decisive way, in a way that didn't unite us. So that illustrates at least the feeling about Bush at the beginning, right after 9/11. By contrast, consider Katrina in Bush's second term, perhaps the greatest weather crisis to ever hit a major American city, and the nation, or at least I remember this, waited for their resolute president. After all, Bush was nothing if not resolute. That was his calling card, his resolution and his decisiveness. So we all waited him to do something, or at least say something in response. As we watched people on bridges starving, we kept expecting the National Guard to show up and help them, to roll in and help them. We kept expecting Bush himself to appear in the same way that he did after 9/11. And instead, this isn't a video, so. Well, instead we got the picture of him looking out the window of an airplane, looking down at the rubble beneath him. So had he responded resolutely, decisively, and with confidence to this crisis, that is, had he projected our expectations of the presidency, this might have dramatically increased his approval ratings. Instead, they plummeted, and this event essentially ruined his second term. You know, in other words, Katrina could have been an opportunity for Bush. Instead, it was the destruction of his presidency. Or one last illustration of my argument, think Carter in response to the Iran hostage situation versus Reagan, the projection of strength and confidence you got in Reagan versus the seeming weakness of Carter, who wasn't able to do anything to respond to the crisis. So I think one of the reasons Carter lost in 1980 was because of the Iran hostage crisis. In conclusion, although the people know that presidents are responsible for handling crises, and the people hold them responsible if they fail or if they succeed, discourse around this aspect of the presidency is strikingly limited. We know it matters, but we don't have the separation of powers conception to know why it matters. Perhaps the best sign of this lack of knowledge are those who said Trump should be judged on his policy accomplishments rather than for everything else. As one writer said, or one commentator said, the rest is just an aesthetic judgment. I'd say that this argument entirely misunderstands the presidency. We should judge a president for his capability to fulfill the presidential oath broadly understood. The presidency is fundamentally about the handling of crises. Again, a president who cannot handle a crisis is no president at all. This isn't to say, however, the presidents must successfully manage the crisis. It might very well be the case to anticipate an objection that COVID wasn't a crisis that could be managed, such that we would have solved it sooner. But again, fulfilling the oath is about more than just the physical handling of the crisis. The president must also make us feel secure. The rhetorical task of a president during a crisis is to evoke the sovereignty that makes everyone feel like everything is going to be okay. And that's perhaps as important as the management tasks. Okay, thank you.
Virtual pause. We have quite a bit of time left for questions, and I'm happy to have some discussion. I guess the easiest way to do it would be to, you feel free, if you have a question, feel free to type your question in the chat, or to raise your real hand or your virtual hand, and I can sort of keep a queue. Or you could just write in the chat that you have a question, and I can call on you, and you can ask it. So. Does anybody have any questions? I can probably ask one to start us off, which is, I guess, what I was wondering is why is there not this awareness of the importance of crises, even among presidential candidates themselves, especially as you noted in running for a first term? I think Bernie Sanders is a pretty good example of this, and you used it, right? If you listen to the Sanders campaign rhetoric, it sounds like the president is running for, as a kind of super legislator I mean, Sanders wanted to push through some very, I guess I would say, legislation that would have had a very little chance to get through a Republican-dominated Senate or even the current Senate. But there was, in a way, not too much attention to that. So, what do you have an opinion as to sort of what explains the sort of the growth, the widespread belief that the president is just basically to be judged on his legislative accomplishments rather than his ability to handle the crisis?
Yeah, I think in a way, our rhetoric and our understanding of presidential authority is at cross purposes. On the one hand, in the wake of, and I think some of you, at least those of you in one of the classes, may have read Jeff Toulis on impeachment. His book on the rhetorical presidency makes this point. That is, on the one hand, in the wake of Woodrow Wilson, we've come to expect legislative promises from presidents. We've come to expect them to have policies and plans and websites that all lay out their plans, and a president who campaigned as though that weren't, and sort of refused to follow that expectation, I think would have a tough time winning. And Fred Thompson, I think maybe 8 years ago, ran for president in the Republican primary, and he promised that he'd be, uphold federalism or something and be a strong leader. He didn't get too far. So on the one hand, we have that expectation. And then on the other hand, we still have, at almost the level of like our constitutional genome or something, it's like built into our constitutional genetics or into our soul, into our constitutional soul, the expectation that presidents will do the job we hired them for. That is, handle a crisis or handle a crisis, manage foreign policy, all of these things that fall particularly on executive decisiveness. So why that's happened, I don't know. I mean, it means we end up speaking in a rather confused way about the president. I think part of it is political science just does nothing to help the situation, because political science refuses to take separation of powers seriously, and as a result can't comprehend presidential authority as distinct from legislative authority.
I have two questions. I actually have three questions in the chat, but the first two are actually quite similar, so I'm just going to read them to you. Charles Hertic, writes that Neustadt posits the power of the president is the power to persuade. How important is rhetoric in crises? And then Alan Witt wrote, thinking back to Hillary Clinton's "It's 3:30 a.m. Who do you want answering the phone?" ad, which failed to net her the nomination. Is there any utility for rhetoric surrounding crisis management during a run for a first term as president? So how important is rhetoric in handling a crisis more generally, but also in running on that record or trying to convince voters that you'd be the best person to handle a crisis?
Yeah, let me start with the latter question, because it sort of tells against some of what I've been arguing. I would say the 3:30, or was it 3 a.m., 3:30 a.m. was her attempt to use her authority, her prior governing authority, against Obama's authority. So it was because she hadn't been a president, but she'd been in office, she'd been a senator, I guess, for longer than Obama. She could attempt to say she'd understand how to handle a crisis in a way that Obama didn't. I think that just didn't, it was, I mean, as much as anything, it just seemed racist. That was the reaction, at least that the press had to it, that it seemed, evoking people's fears about a black man, late at night or something like that. But I think the commercial itself says something about what we want from presidential authority. That she thought it would work says that she thought people would respond to it. The second question was, what was the second question?
That how important is rhetoric in the midst of crises?
Yeah, so one of the things I was trying to say is that I think it's really important. It's actually struck me, the more I've thought about this, especially in light of COVID, I've been more and more struck by how important rhetoric is. That I think what we want from the presidency is that they manage, from the president, is that they can manage crises. But we also just want to feel secure. We as a people need something to unify around, and that's the president. It's not going to be a Congress. Congress isn't something you unify around. And so presidential rhetoric that brings us that unity makes us all feel better. We can make it through this as a people. I don't know if you remember, but a meme on Facebook was the Queen's speech to the British people during the COVID crisis. And people were sharing this, and it's just a kind of conventional, oh, we'll get through this as a people. It's, it's very conventional thing you say during crises. That is, we'll get through this, etc. But it seemed like a real act of leadership because Trump never gave us that. He never just gave us that speech that said, we'll get through this, feel better, we'll all come together. And instead it was just antics, one antic after another. So I think rhetoric is really important, and it's not important just to make presidents popular. It's also substantively important. What we want to feel as a people is secure, and crises make us feel insecure.
Our next question is from Haley Fleischer, who says, do you find that people's opinions on how well the president handled the crisis changes based on their party affiliation, or if they support the president or not? Or is there generally an overall agreement on whether they did well or not?
Yeah, I think party affiliation obviously has an effect. The Republicans are going to judge Republican presidents better, and Democrats are going to judge Democratic presidents better. But I don't think it's the entirety of the effect. That is, I think there's a way in which crises can be bipartisan in what people like. So in the wake of 9/11, Bush's approval rating was at, I think, something like 75%, because he just seemed, he seemed like who we wanted on the job in response to 9/11. And so even, I told the story about my sister, even Democrats liked Bush in the wake of 9/11. Whereas in the wake of Katrina, even Republicans didn't like Bush. This isn't to say that partisanship doesn't matter, but I think you can efface partisanship a fair amount through management of crises.
Our next question is from Carly Harold, who says, asks, is this dynamic complicated at all by the fact that right now there is profound disagreement between the political parties about what even constitutes a crisis in the first place?
I'm sorry, is this dynamic? I had a brain. I saw another question that I thought was really interesting, but is this dynamic complicated at all?
Yeah.
Well, no, sorry, it was an empirical question, and I've been thinking about that lately. By the fact that right now there's profound, I mean, what is a crisis and what is not? Yeah, I think that's a problem. I mean, this is one of the problems with COVID, is it's this weird silent crisis. When you have like a weather disaster like Katrina, you don't wonder whether New Orleans is in crisis when it's underwater. When you have a silent virus that's killing people, but people die, more people are dying from COVID, but it doesn't feel like crisis in the same way, unless the Republicans would say that the Democrats manufactured the crisis, by overstating the dangers and stuff. And so it does matter. I think partisanship partisanship affects everything in our politics now. But I wanted to is there research out there measuring the effectiveness of rhetoric based on crisis management versus rhetoric based on legislative plans in the context of a first-term election? Yeah, it's funny you ask that, because I've just been about to approach, I don't do any kind of empirical political science, but it strikes me that a lot of what I'm saying could have empirical ramifications. So it is something I could work with an empirical political scientist about to show like how approval ratings fluctuate in response to crises and management and rhetoric in managing crises. I don't know anything about how to do that, but it strikes me as a possibility. So right now I'm just like, I mean, I can see that Bush's approval ratings plummeted in response to Katrina. So I feel like you can somewhat reliably make the judgment that there's that connection. An empirical political scientist would probably say I can't, but I don't know.
Actually, on that note, I mean, I want to read Daniel Crowley's question in the chat, which is, do you think, given the COVID-19 crisis and the differences in leadership we've seen, that there will soon be a demand for crisis management plans from potential candidates? I was actually thinking about that question with regard to just what the 2016 election was like, where you had this weird situation where experience was actually counted against you. Hillary Clinton tried to run as the experienced candidate. She did it in 2008 as well against Obama, and both times it hurt her. But in 2016, especially, she was, the way that having experience in government and therefore the ability, you would think, to respond to a crisis was sort of counted as a negative, and that's part of what helped Trump win. So I wanted, along with Danielle, I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think it's no accident that in the wake of a presidency seemed marked by inexperience and the problems associated with inexperience, we got a president who's seemingly much more experienced. I'm always a little wary of senatorial experience. I think the Senate teaches people how to debate things and how to run for the Senate again. I kind of like governors better than senators as having executive experience. They actually have executive experience in a way that senators don't. And for a while, we tended only to be electing governors. I think for precisely that reason. There's some confidence that a governor knows how to be an executive in a way that a president doesn't. Until, try to think. Yeah, I mean, I would have to, but for a long time, it was governors winning. Clinton was a governor, Bush was a governor, Reagan had been a governor. Precisely, I think, because they could make this claim to executive experience. So will we in the next election be looking for crisis management plans? I don't know. I somehow feel like the next election is going to be a governor who wins. If I were to bet on something, I'd bet on a governor winning. If Biden doesn't run again, or even if Biden were to win, yeah, I mean, if Biden doesn't run again, my bet is that a governor wins, either a Republican or a Democratic governor, which is the closest you can get to a crisis management plan of sorts.
We just have a new question in the chat from Kelsey Ducks, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. How about gender? Would you say that the gender of the person impacts how the public views their confidence and ability to handle a crisis, allowing for female politicians such as Hillary to be seen as incapable, despite claiming experience? I actually was wondering just about that also with regard to your last set of comments, because of course, if Biden doesn't run in 4 years, the vice president would seem to be the natural choice.
Yeah, I think that's a real question. I think that's a problem in a way. Well, that's precisely, in a funny way, what Hillary was appealing to in the 3 a.m. call, that Obama as a Black man wouldn't be able to handle a crisis as well as she could as a kind of white woman who's been in power before or something like that. But yeah, I think the problem is more decisive for women. I mean, my read on the 2016 election was less about the gender question and more about the kind of wanting someone who was new to the job question. But I could be wrong. I can't read the hearts. I would say that to the extent I'm right, that American people want someone who can handle a crisis, seemingly there is the danger that they're always going to think men are better than women. I mean, anyone who's married with children knows that women are much better at handling a crisis than men. So, yeah.
Other question. I also have a comment in the or a message to me from Nick Lorenzo. Hope you don't mind if I share this. That in foreign countries have had he says have had perhaps more of a history of electing strong women, like Margaret Thatcher was his example for handling crises.
Yeah, although I mean, the British example is a nice way of thinking about the difference between our president and a British prime minister. That is, when you elect a prime minister, you really are electing the prime legislator. You're electing the legislator in chief. The British depend for unifying sovereignty. The Queen still does that in a certain way. I mean, there's a reason why in the midst of the COVID crisis, it was the Queen speaking to the British people, not so much the prime minister. So the British experience is actually the example that shows I mean, we have both a president who's head of state, who's the chief, sort of represents our sovereignty and is somehow legislative. I think by contrast, Margaret Thatcher was the legislator, was sort of in charge of the parliament and is legislating, and less in charge of handling crises, or less perceived as less in charge of being the person you look to in crisis. I mean, I used your question to say something else, so now I'll return to your question. I mean, Margaret Thatcher seemed, so here's the gender problem. Margaret Thatcher seemed tougher than anyone else in the world at that time. She just like projected confidence and toughness. So I don't think being a woman was a problem for her. In some ways, it made her seem that much stronger, because as a woman, she was even tougher than all the men. The Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher projected toughness. So, which is to say, in other words, gender isn't an inherent disability. I think there's ways to overcome it. I actually thought Hillary could have campaigned in 2016 on something closer to like the Margaret Thatcher model. I'm tough as nails. I'm going to be able to handle the problems that we encounter as a country. That guy, he's a playboy. He won't.
The next question on the chat is from Noah Longshore, who says, do you think if we had experienced a significant crisis in the year leading up to the 2016 election, that Clinton may have been able to gain more traction with her campaign on experience? It's similar to what you were just addressing.
Yeah, I think so. I think I think you would have wanted to stick with, if you're having an election in the midst of a crisis, you either want to re-elect the person who's there now and is handling it well, or you want to re-elect someone like the person who's there now and is handling it well. By contrast, if you're having an election in the midst of a crisis and the person in charge isn't handling it well, you want to elect someone dramatically different. So that's Reagan in '80. Reagan represented the anti-Carter. He represented someone who could, deal with this more decisively than Carter could.
Yeah. The argument for Bush in 2004 was something like, that you don't change horses in the middle of a race, that we're in this crisis now, the Iraq War. And of course, that infuriated Democrats because you created this crisis. And so,
yeah, no, and that's right. And that's why I think Bush won 2004, because he seemed like the kind of guy who could always handle a crisis, which is why Katrina in 2005 was so disastrous, I think, for his presidency, because that was his calling card. You might hate him for all kinds of other reasons, but at least when, the old Ghostbusters, who are you going to call? The answer was Bush, that Bush would be the immediate response. In 2000, in the Katrina, nothing. It was nothing. I can remember watching the news, I kept expecting airplanes to come and help those people starving on bridges, and there was nothing.
Yeah. And perhaps something similar in the 2008 financial crisis too, just before he left office.
Yeah. Yeah. He was, that commercial, a deer in the headlights. Presidents don't want to look like a deer in the headlights. And if they do, it's disastrous for them.
Other questions? You can raise your virtual hand or your real hand. Or type them in the chat.
Kelsey Ducks has another question about
about
gender. But with each character type, a woman is put in there. And there are positives and negatives: Iron Maiden, immoral, not relatable to everyday struggles, unable to handle family policy procedures, while the other type, maternal energy, implies that they're too emotional and weak. Yeah, I think, why don't you speak, Kelsey? Can she speak?
Yeah, so the point I wanted to make on that is that, although there were benefits that Margaret Thatcher, and also it's Kelsey Dukes, but no worries, just wanted to.
Sorry,
No worries. Y'all can't read my mind, and language is an interesting thing. But that with the benefits that come with going against that, maternal or emotional side that women are usually put into as a character type, there's negatives that also come with that. So it's just so interesting to think about as a leader, when women are put in those positions, it seems that no matter how they were to respond to a crisis, whether it comes as, I'm going to be like a robot, like I'm going to be that Iron Maiden, not emotional side, or like I am very caring about, with that family approach of I don't want to say emotional, but you know what I mean? With that approach that they're put into, there's all negatives. There's always negatives that'll come into the interpretation of how that person goes against a crisis that have to do with sexism of oh, well, she's not really taking into account our families and our struggles that she can't relate to because she doesn't have emotion and she doesn't care about the family life, but they'll put her in more situations, they'll trust her more with finances and issues of war and whatnot. But then the other side, the other politicians who are women who are put in the more emotional side will not be taken seriously when it comes to economics and things like that have to do with crisis. At least that's my take on it.
Yeah, that seems right. I mean, I think, and this is the challenge, I think in some ways, centralizing the extent to which the presidency is about crisis and about handling crisis helps us think through, I think most clearly, the gender problem, because that really, it highlights what we're looking for in presidents and the problem that women face given what we're looking for. So I don't know the solution to it, but I think that's definitely identifies a problem. I think there are probably ways of navigating that problem. I think Margaret Thatcher is in a way an example of one way to navigate that problem. I think it's only a matter of time before we see a female president. I always joke with my daughter that she's Jewish, Asian, and a woman, and she could break 3 barriers at once if she became president. So,
other questions? I have a couple more, but I don't want to hear from other students out there who may.
Can they speak their questions?
Yeah, can you? Yeah, you can feel free to speak your questions. But you do. I'm probably doing a terrible job reading them, so yeah, feel free to raise your hand, and I can call on you. I was actually, maybe I'll just ask this while other people are thinking questions of, with regard to with Trump and with regard to Trump and his popularity, and also you were mentioning the chapters in prerogative on the second prerogative in the second treatise at the opening, that there's the tension in Locke. There seems to be that the president can take certain actions, extra legal or dubious actions, but then to respond to a crisis, but then those crises are judged by, his performance or her performance is judged by the people, or as Locke says, appeal to heaven, but it's the people who make that interpretation ultimately. And so could you see civic virtue in the population as a sort of, I don't know, the flip side of presidential crisis management?
Yeah, the Locke section, are most of these students in the class that they're going to read Locke?
I think some of them, I'm not sure.
Some of them. The Locke section reminds me of, until writing this book and until recently, I think it always struck me that crises are dangerous for republics because they are a way that executives can consolidate power at the expense of the legislature and become dangerous in so doing. So if you read the chapter on Locke, chapter on prerogative in Locke in the second treatise carefully, I think that's the teaching, that there's something dangerous about prerogative in the hands of an executive, because the people are so satisfied by a president who can handle crises well, or not a president, but an executive who can handle crises well. So just a long way of, somehow this was going to answer your question, Aaron, and now I'm lost my train of thought. Yeah, I can't remember. What was the rest of your question?
Oh, it's civic virtue.
In terms of judging.
So now you have the Fifth Avenue problem, right? That Trump could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and his supporters, 47% of the electorate would still be in favor of him. Whatever the number was.
You'd want, you'd want a civic virtue to the extent that they can judge who's presidential and who's not, I think is really important. The ability to judge that, the thought that Trump would be presidential strikes me as a real problem in our civic virtue, honestly. Because there's not much, if you understand how prudence works, and prudence is critical to managing crises, there's not much in Trump's behavior that suggests prudence. It's sort of anti-prudence. So what the people need to be able to judge is something like the prudence of the likely prudence of their president. So they, can look at Washington and say, George Washington, and say, that's a guy who can embody prudence. If you look at, nothing about Trump suggests any kind of prudence, and in a crisis, that's what you need. You someone who's just like, rambling about Lysol and such isn't prudent. So in terms of civic virtue, that's my worry, that we're not good at judging character, and most importantly, prudence.
This might be a good place to stop, considering we're just about out of time. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our speaker. I think that this was great. I really enjoyed this, and I hope you did too. And I hope we can have you back sometime when the current crisis is over, and we can go eat steaks at Ember or something like that.
Sounds nice.
And I'm looking forward to that, to being in the flesh with people again. So we're within 6 feet at least. But thank you very much for agreeing to come speak to us. And I think this is a really great event. So if I think we can stick around if anybody has any other, if you want to chat at all, or if there's any other questions. But if not, thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you all.